All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, December 8th, and let's talk about this national security strategy paper that the White House put out. It seems like it's a seismic shift in foreign policy, but I don't want to get too excited. So is
Right.
this huge? Is this something to be genuinely excited about?
Um, I would say it's yet another indication. Well, that first of all, there clearly are people on within the Trump administration, including Trump himself, who do have a radically different vision of U.S. foreign policy, radically different from those of his predecessors. Going back decades. I would say that it is a very solid, thorough rejection of neoconservatism. Now, having said that, and there are a lot of interesting things in there, which maybe is giving us a glimpse of the future. But let's just go back to the present reality. I don't know that it's going to have any impact. It tells us something about how some people think in there, but let us not forget how many reversals, how many, really amazing speeches or, even comments by our Secretary of State Rubio. Remember at the beginning of this term, he essentially, he talked about the multipolar world and how that was inevitable and we needed to accept it. If we went on for a few sentences, but then everything else, it seems like all his actions actually are not at all in conformity with that thinking. So those thoughts are there, it's important, but it's not clear that policy is going to significantly change or has even significantly changed. It's changed in some ways, that we've discussed. And I think this this lays it out. This is a thinking that the president has. And it is a rejection of neoconservatism, a very thorough rejection of it. But the neoconservatives are still there. They surround him, and they will continue to influence him.
Well, isn't this much more significant putting it in a document like this? I don't know the significance of the national security
Mhm.
strategy document, but it seems to be definitely hold more weight than just Marco Rubio saying
Sure.
something during an interview, right? So in that sense, is it a truly substantive change?
Well, it's still, again, it still doesn't mean that policy will change. It's not legally binding. Nobody's actually forced to follow the document. I think that they'll pay lip service to it. And there are enough ambiguities in the document that people can always claim that, yeah, we're following the national security strategy. And when in fact they're not. And I can point to things, I mean, again, that Trump himself does. It doesn't really seem to be at all consistent with what's expressed in this document.
So, I mean, often we talk about the government. There's the unelected bureaucrats, the so-called deep state, and then there are a few black sheep. And Trump is one of them. He obviously gets corralled back
Sometimes.
in, right? Well, but occasionally. So, are you saying that this document then is a product of these black sheep within the government, and it's really, or is it truly actually the deep state is participating in this, and there is an admission from these unelected bureaucrats, the deep state itself, that yes, there is a new reality and we have to
Right.
accept it.
I think there's a little bit of both in there. I think maybe we got to talk about the document
Yeah,
itself
okay,
so that we can
good
start.
point. Good point.
Yeah,
People may not even know
right.
what we're talking about so far.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. First I'll explain what I mean when I say that it is a thorough rejection of neoconservatism. Neoconservatism is, it's an ideology that aims to export, America, the American way of life, with revolutionary fervor throughout the world. If you can recall, just think back to the early, the first few years of this century under George W. Bush. It was he spoke of basically a war against evil, and a war to bring democracy to the world. And you got a lot of that kind of language, not just from him, but from Condoleezza Rice and others, very high-ranking officials. They were completely animated by that ideology. We're going to launch these wars to make the world, democratic, to remake the world in our image. And this is a war against evil. All of that language is gone, and it's explicitly rejected in this document. And I find that interesting. But again, the neoconservatives are still there. They're hanging around. Just on that particular topic, I noticed that the New York Times came out with an opinion piece, and they put it this way: it's like in Trump's new national security strategy paper, he abandons the quest for to spreading democracy and just looks to make money. And putting it in very crude terms, that's more or less true. It's not that crude, but it's just saying we're going to do things that benefit the U.S. We're not going to be, just driven by this ideological zeal. We're not going to go around and overthrow governments because we don't like, the way the way they're constituted or whatever. It's just like it explicitly says that we respect. There are different ways of life, and different countries have different ways of doing things, and we're fine with that. That's okay. So in a way, you look at that language, that seems to be a recognition of multipolarity, a completely different change of mind. So there's that. Another aspect of it is a definite, let's say, retrenchment, a change of focus, from the whole world, and especially from Europe and Asia. Asia less so. We'll get into that later, but definitely, from Europe to the Western Hemisphere. And it says it puts the Western Hemisphere first. That should be, when listing it's the core interests of the U.S., it names the Western Hemisphere at the top of that list. And it talks about, again, how this is where we should be, again, allocating our resources and enforcing something, the Monroe Doctrine, but a kind of a an enhanced Monroe Doctrine, a Monroe Doctrine with the Trump corollary. And it's not quite sure. It's not, the corollary is never spelled out, but there is a lot of discussion. And I think from that you can see things. There's one sentence that really jumped out at me, and it just said that we want, all of the nations, that means all the nations of the Western Hemisphere, to choose us as their leading partner. We should be their first choice, throughout this hemisphere. And, we will resort to various means, to make sure that they collaborate with us. I'm butchering it a little bit, but that's essentially what it is, that we will employ, if they don't, basically, if we're not the partner of first choice, we will, through various means, that's the exact language that was used, make ourselves, make them collaborate with us. And that's quite extraordinary, right? I mean, this is quite a, well, what does that mean exactly? Collaborate, it's, and where is it a problem? It really is a rejection of sovereignty of these countries if they're not allowed to collaborate. We're not talking about, putting missiles in Cuba.
It's building bridges, roads.
Yeah,
things like
exactly.
that.
Right. Exactly. It just said, economic relationships. If you have a major economic relationship with China is the number one investor, foreign investor in your country. That's something that we don't like. And we will, through various means, change that. That's what we're looking at. Now, this is quite extraordinary because, first of all, when you think about, okay, this is quite a large sphere of influence that we're talking about, and it's more than a sphere of influence. The Western Hemisphere is half the world, right? It's... it goes all the way down to Argentina and Brazil. We're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of miles, from the U.S. border. But there are no exceptions made here. There is also talk about, a militarization of the anti-drug war. You say that we realize that that's not sufficient, and sometimes that we have to use lethal military means. So, think about Venezuela. Of course, bring up the subject of Venezuela. We're threatening them. It's using the language of this document. They are narco-terrorists, and we're using military means to stop it. But of course, that's nonsense. In fact, the cartel that they're supposed to be fighting according to most people, doesn't even exist. The Cartel de los Soles is something that's just invented. So this is just pure fabrication. This is something to keep in mind. We have this document. Things are spelled out. Some of the language seems very, very pretty, and a lot of it makes sense. But we have an administration that can just tell a lie, in order to conform to this document, to this strategic thinking. But then another thing, but there's also the economic relationships. And I think that's what's going on. They got oil. They're cooperating with China and Russia. We don't like that. And then go back to that statement through various means. One of the means, of course, can be military. And that's what's happening in Venezuela. So again, the Western Hemisphere is put first. When you go to East Asia is taken seriously. China is not even mentioned very often. It's often, but that they're talking about China. Now, China is seen as an adversary, but the language is actually pretty calm, and there's a lot of realism there. If you read it carefully, you can see that this is actually, I think, a sobering up, in their view of China. We talked earlier about a RAND paper that came out and said that, hey, we can't really beat China there. Let's just try to learn to get along. Let's stabilize the relationship. And I think you see some of that thinking throughout here. Just to give you one example, it says, okay, they talk about deterrence in Taiwan. It says that that's a priority, but it doesn't say it's the priority. It really is kind of much more moderate language. And they say that we can ideally do through a military overmatch, but ideally is an implication that that's not the real situation. And so we don't really have that military overmatch. There was a time when we did, and we could deter, Chinese military action. Ideally, we could do that, but again, the use of the word ideally tells you that, okay, there's a recognition that that's not what's really happening. And then later you get it more explicit. You talk about, we need to build up this coalition, with Japan and South Korea and so forth, and the Philippines. Because, otherwise, basically, we could find ourselves in a very disadvantaged balance of power, which means that, again, there's a recognition if it's the U.S. on its own, we are outmatched. And so our only chance of actually deterring China is through this coalition. So I found that actually, again, the discussion on China was very sober. And there was no ideological element, it wasn't to talk about we got to bring democracy to China or anything like that. There may have been a little bit of that, but again, that's not what we see in the document. It's about economics and just kind of a hard-headed assessment of the balance of power. Then the one part of the document that's probably received the most comment is the part that focuses on Europe. And that's quite interesting. And it's basically said, like, Europe is, I think this is what we talked about in our last episode back on Friday. Europe is a dying civilization. And it does refer to this creeping authoritarianism, loss of free speech rights, the demographic problems, cultural problems, the unrestricted immigration that is changing it's like changing Europe. You say at one point, some of these countries were not going to be recognizably European anymore. There's all of those things. And I think in general, it was actually a pretty accurate assessment. And then it says there are patriotic movements within Europe, which basically we need to support. So, and what I think it's clear to everybody that the paper is talking about populist right-wing movements like the AfD or the National Rally in France. Now, that's interesting. And then also there's very, very little, virtually no discussion of Russia, and I couldn't see anything negative about Russia. It was that it says, the Europeans are stupid. They got themselves into this fix, and they need to make peace with Russia. And, I have to agree with that. But at the same time, there's a little bit of, there's a complete lack of self-reflection. They've got themselves into this fix. Of course, the Americans pushed them hard to do this, to go down this road. There's no recognition of that. And then he's talking about, they have they now find themselves in a real economic bind. And it mentions like Chinese plant, not Chinese, but rather German chemical plants that are relocating to China in good part, to take advantage of cheap Russian energy.
Right.
They say, okay, yeah, good point. But, who blew up the pipeline and who's trying to cut off all the links to Russia? So again, sometimes you look at this language, but then you look at the administration and you can see two very different things going on at the same time.
There has to be fury in Europe, right? I mean, just when I think about the pipeline thing, just this line about the pipeline where we blew up their energy infrastructure, and then we say, oh, look at Europe facing economic collapse and civilizational erasure, and we were behind it. We were championing it. We did it. We did the.
Yeah,
we blew
I
up
think
the
there's
pipeline.
no doubt that we did it.
You have that video.
But there's no question that, there's a very open campaign against it all along. We were, and right now, we are pushing them, and their leaders are very willing to, cut off the remaining energy links between Russia and Europe.
Yeah, it seems like if you're an ally of the United States, you just get used and abused. But if you stand up, if you're part of BRICS, you actually earned respect, at least what it seems like in this national security strategy paper. Would you agree? Or that's kind of the lesson to take is don't, supplicate yourself fully to the United States because they'll just trample you. And then, this.
Well, yeah, it seems to be true. I guess I would say there's something more. That's part of it, I think. Trump respects strength, and he despises weakness, and he sees these European leaders as weak, and they are behaving in just a really weak manner. There's no question about it. None of them seem to have a spine, and it's really. We've all seen the scenes of them gathered around the great leader Trump, and it's very cringe-inducing, right? I mean, it's just really rather disgusting. It's embarrassing. And yeah, it doesn't actually, it maybe leads him to tolerate them, but he doesn't respect them. I think there's no question about that. But it's more than that. I found myself thinking, because again, the language that was used to criticize the Europeans is in a lot of ways just reflects the kind of language that's used domestically within, we have a kind of a culture war that's been going on here for a while. Let's say the Blues versus the Reds. Now the Reds are ascendant, and they get to write this document. And so it's almost like they're looking at, okay, we've won here in the U.S., but in Europe, they're still blue. With a couple of exceptions, like Orban's Hungary. They're still blue over there, and we need to the implication is, at least maybe not export the revolution, but we got to support, the red patriots over there. Mm-hmm. Let me just turn this off here.
So, but is this document, is it something that we can truly be excited about, that this signals a real policy shift, that we should see things follow? Or do you believe that at the end it's just a document, and if we don't see any real substantive change, we know it's just nothing? And then if Trump's out of office and somebody else comes into power, do you think that it could just shift straight back the other way? So
Yeah, there's nothing that prevents that from happening. Let's be honest. If the Democrats come roaring back, and there's a real chance that that is what will happen. We had some elections recently, and the Democrats did very well. They were expected to do well, but they did even better than was expected, and that may be just an indication of things to come. That there may be a Democratic, there could be, nothing's guaranteed. There could be a Democratic landslide in the next presidential election, right? In 2028. But yeah, so a lot of it does depend on that. It could be just looked at an interesting historical footnote. This paper came out, and it'll never resurface again. Who knows what the future will bring? But if, for example, the Democrats self-destruct, which is always a possibility. You think about the candidates they've put forward in the last couple of presidential elections. They may self-destruct again. And let's say J.D. Vance wins. And I think J.D. Vance actually wrote part of this document, probably especially the part about Europe. Then, this actually, we could see a consolidation of this sort of very, let's say, again, haphazard, inconsistent, move in this new strategic direction. We've seen sort of the beginnings of a reorientation, but it hasn't been. The revolution really hasn't been carried out. It hasn't been comprehensively implemented by any means. But that could happen under J.D. Vance. I just think that he's a more disciplined person that might actually follow through on it, that actually does believe in important parts of this document and may have the discipline to put, and the organizational skills to put together a team that will carry this out. And then it could actually become the guiding spirit of American foreign policy. So a lot depends, I think, on the next election.
So this idea of retrenchment, do we really honestly think that we would retrench away from Israel in the Middle East? Back to the Western Hemisphere? What about the Middle East?
Yeah, well, it says quite explicitly that the Middle East, we've spent too much time there. It's time to turn away from the Middle East. And basically it's like, we won there, or Israel won, and we don't need to worry. We can't ignore it entirely, but it's a low priority region for us now.
Is that language just to constrain Netanyahu, you think? Just don't start any more wars? Just
I don't think so. I think that's real. They would just as soon, they do have they have just as soon leave it. But can they? And one thing is just when you mention the Middle East and we start talking about Israel, that's something that really struck me throughout. There are a lot of interesting sentences within this national security strategy paper. I'd read it that, for example, we will not allow ourselves to be sucked into conflicts on behalf of other countries. They have their own. The conflict may be, vital to them, but it's irrelevant to us. That kind of thing. Or we have to guard ourselves from undue influence from other countries, including espionage and, direct media influence. We must guard ourselves, against this. And each time when I read that, I just think immediately Israel. That's if you want to talk about being pulled into wars, the Iraq war, the conflict against Iran, we all know, the number one culprit is Israel. Anybody who's paying attention, or we're talking about undue influence and espionage. Just the other day, we were talking, about Jonathan Pollard. It's Israel. And so again and again, but then see, this is where the paper, the paper's one thing, which, I think overall is really quite reasonable. But then the actions of the administration are something else entirely, and one of those glaring exceptions, again, is Israel. It's just like nothing applies to Israel, it seems.
And you think that will be the case moving forward? That it's just sort of
I'm afraid
implied
so, yeah.
We shouldn't even hope that we would actually, decouple from Israel in some meaningful way. It just
I don't see any signs of it. I don't believe, no. There may be growing frictions. I think, again, Trump is committed to this 21-point peace plan that he has in the Middle East, for Palestine. And the Israelis clearly don't want some of those things to be implemented. But when, like we see, it is clear, in spite of the preferences of the Trump administration, it's so obvious that whose side our administration, the U.S., is on here. We've talked about the ceasefire violations. They are been overwhelmingly on the Israeli side, and there's no pushback. It just happens. They kill people every day. They, blow up houses. They're only sending like 15% of what they promised to deliver, et cetera. It goes on and on and on. The list is, and I think, we're talking about, we're approaching 1,000 ceasefire violations and not a word. So it just say, okay, yeah, but at the same time in the Israeli press, you say, okay, yeah, Netanyahu's under pressure from the U.S. Yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. If he actually does something that he really doesn't want to do, like establish an international peacekeeping force or withdrawing from more of the territory of Gaza. We'll see. There may be. I think there's a certain amount of friction there, but it's clear that the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, and particularly the U.S. and Zionism, it hasn't fundamentally changed.
Do you see the Middle East still as a powder keg ready to explode soon? I mean, it just seems like it's died down since the ceasefire, but I mean, it's still awful there in Gaza. I've been seeing some horrific footage, so people haven't forgotten. We're still watching this. Israel's still the most hated country in the world, and it continues to be acting with impunity. So, how does this play out? Do you see it popping off in some way, and how would it pop off? Because obviously the people in Gaza, they can't fight back in any meaningful way. They're caged in and being starved to death. They don't have homes. They don't have anything. Is anything going to happen? Are we just going to slowly watch them die?
Well, that's the horror, and it's again, it's happening in the West Bank too as we speak. It almost seems to me that it's more likely. Well, what's driving this and what is going to have a bigger impact on Israeli actions in the future is really domestic politics, and the survival instincts of Netanyahu. We'll see, because again, there are those forces that are willing to accept the ceasefire for the time being. They got more than half of Gaza, but they want it all. They want to drive them out. And at the same time, the rest of the country really wants a longer rest. It's not like they've abandoned Zionism or they really care about Palestinians now, but they don't want to see a resumption of open hostilities. So I think that's where things are going to be decided, is on the domestic front right now for the time being. But the larger expansionist project has not been abandoned in Israel. Will continue, and it's going to continue to raise tensions within the Middle East. That's not going to end. There's still a lot of anger. Much of the Western world has turned away. It's clear that, again, European governments realize that, the spotlight isn't on us anymore, and they're just resuming their relationship with Israel. They, where they had made really cosmetics or changes or very minor changes in the relationship to show some disfavor, those are ending. Like in Germany, there were some restrictions on arms shipments to Israel. And it's interesting, actually, Germany is one of the major suppliers of arms to Israel. It's by far the leading supplier of arms to Israel after the United States. Something like 30% or 29% of the arms that Israel imports come from Germany. So they had suspended some shipments. I think, it was pretty minor, but now even that minor suspension has ended and everything's going forward. But much of the world, is not being tricked. And I think even within Europe, most people on the ground know what's going on. This isn't going away. I don't know how it's going to play out. I think, again, probably, unfortunately, I don't think anybody's going to force Israel's hand from the outside. The only one who potentially could do that is Trump. But he seems to continually disappoint, and he just fails to follow through. He does have his preferences, but it seems like the other side, they know how to wear him down and eventually get their way. And I think that's what's going to happen in Israel. And then it's just within Israel, is the ethnic cleansing going to accelerate, or is it going to be put on hold for a while? And that kind of depends on domestic politics.
For the Israeli settlers, and I know Ben-Gvir Smotrich, isn't a big part of what they want to do is to rebuild the Temple Mount, right?
Some of Yeah, that's something that's not anywhere close to a majority view in Israel, but there is a substantial minority.
I'm
It used to be truly fringe. Yeah, the I think Ben Gvir is closely associated with that movement, for example. And Ben Gvir has real power. I mean, he has power over the police within Israel, and then Smotrich does too. Interestingly, he's the minister of finance, yet he maybe it's through that position, but he has a great deal of power in the West Bank. So we've seen that's one of the reasons for the acceleration of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank.
Do you think? Well, I imagine.
I
imagine most of the settlers probably are wanting that, right? I mean, they're more radicalized in the West Bank,
right?
There,
well,
so.
Again, there are the ideological settlers, and then there are economic settlers. There are people who just get cheap housing, and they don't necessarily think any differently from the average Israeli. But the average Israeli is pretty extreme already. But the true extremists, the ideological settlers, the ones that are actively abusing Palestinians and stealing their land. Yeah, I'm sure that they're all on the, in favor of building the third temple.
Right. And Israel has shown that it has no qualms in destroying mosques and churches. I'm just wondering if at some point in time, do you think that Netanyahu would give that green light to someone like Ben Gvir and Smotrich to say, yeah, let this begin as the final kind of nuclear option? If he really needs a war, it seems like that's the clearest one. I mean, and it seems clear that I know they don't like it. They don't like seeing the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's the Israelis just want to erase the Palestinians. And that's just that huge eyesore right there in Jerusalem for them. They want to I imagine they just want to get rid of it. And if they do, then that would just be boom, huge war probably, right? that would definitely kick something off.
Yeah, you would think so. And I think there's no doubt that they're inching towards it. In fact, they have been increasing restrictions on Muslim worshipers there. They're just making it more and more difficult. They haven't outright banned, Muslim worship there. It's still a Muslim mosque, but they do things, just to, for whatever reason, they'll prohibit worshipers from entering the mosque on a certain day, often on holy days, and also they are tunneling beneath the mosque. I don't know exactly where they are, or that's something that's sort of off again and on again. I think it started and then it was actually stopped by a previous administration. But it's just like there's this constant pressure, to take the mosque. They're inching towards it. And, as I think politics in Israel, if it continues on its current trajectory, eventually it's going to happen. It's a minority that wants to do that now. A lot of people might be sympathetic, but they just say, this is too risky. We shouldn't do that. That's kind of crazy. But at some point, we'll have enough of the extremists. The extremists will have enough power and constitute a large enough, percentage of the population that it will happen. I don't know when that day is, but it's going to. I think there's no question that it will happen. It will be attempted at some point.
Do you think that what's been set in action since October 7th is ultimately going to culminate in this? We're not going to be able to see Israel return to any sense of normalcy. What happened on October 7th has fundamentally changed Israel, and the idea of going back to whatever it had in its relationship with the world is over. And so what we have in motion is just this increasing isolation of Israel, being an international pariah, and Israel just continues its slow expansionist, project. It continues to kill people in Gaza, take more land, don't let them rebuild, take land in the West Bank until there's they do something provocative enough to start some type of larger war. That's basically what you predict.
I think that's probably fair enough to say. Right now things have slowed down because of the ceasefire, but they haven't stopped. After the ceasefire took effect, the Israelis built a wall, for example, in Lebanon that gobbled up some Lebanese land. Not a huge amount, but that's often how they work. It's incremental. They're going back to that incremental approach, and then of course in Syria, they're building new walls in the West Bank, or a fence that cuts through the Jordan Valley. and it's just going to make it life even more difficult. It's already so difficult for the people who live there, and the settlements continue to expand. They continue to grab land there, So the expansion is happening as we speak. And even within Gaza, where things are supposed to have been frozen for the time being and they're supposed to withdraw, there's this yellow line, but they have moved the yellow line, again, by not a whole lot, but they'll move it forward 100 yards there, 50 yards there. Even within Gaza, they're just nibbling away at the little that remains of Gaza, the less than 50% of already a very small territory. So the expansion continues. Right now it's gradual. They clearly are intent on ethnically cleansing Gaza, but they're trying to figure out how to do it. And they are coming up against some pushback from above all from the Persian Gulf states and Turkey and Egypt, maybe above all Egypt. See, there was this attempt to open the Rafah crossing, but only in one direction, meaning Palestinians, Gazans could leave, but they could not return. And again, according to the ceasefire, the 21-point peace plan, that crossing was supposed to be open and supposed to be two-way. But, they haven't opened it. Then they said they were going to, but it was only going to go one way. And that actually led to some a real pushback from Egypt and from some of the other states that are associated with this peace plan. So for the time being, they've held back on that. So they do have to proceed cautiously, but it's clear that they're still intent on ethnic cleansing.
Can we hope for any official ruling, like from the ICJ? They had this plausible case for genocide, and it's been ongoing forever. But, we've had genocide scholars say that this is without a doubt a genocide. We've had a plethora of human rights organizations call this a genocide. But despite all that, there's no repercussions, So, but if we just get to this point where it's like, hey, it's undeniable. We have mountains of video evidence. We have quotes directly from all of your politicians and your military personnel saying, kill them all, this genocidal language throughout that you've been spouting for 2 years and more than 2 years. We've been seeing it from your society, from your politicians everywhere. It just, there's no way you can deny it. Then won't there be some repercussions? Or, you can't have a country that just can just commit genocide and get away with it, right? That's so crazy.
Yeah, well, they have so far, let's be honest. But they haven't gotten away with it with the majority of people in the world. But unfortunately, those people that really count, as far as Israel is concerned, people like, the Merz government or the Trump administration, they're still very, very strong supporters of Israel, and it obviously hasn't diminished the support that they provide Israel in any meaningful way. They've just been basically just wrist slaps. Merz, by the way, is now in Israel, I think, as we speak. And that's another example of normalization. Everything's okay now. It's like, oh, yeah, we had that kind of misunderstanding or that rather unpleasant conflict, but it's over. And though I hear that Merz is, for example, I think, again, this doesn't really mean a whole lot, but he was, for example, pressuring or reminding Netanyahu, not to simply annex the West Bank. That's something that I think that like all these governments agree with, even the very, very strong supporters of Israel, because it's just so blatant. So they would rather have it as it is. Technically, this is not their territory, but they don't ever, including the Persian Gulf countries, they hardly ever say anything about, the de facto ethnic cleansing that takes place there every day. So they're fine with that, but they just don't want it to be too obvious. That's, I think, the unfortunate truth, including Merz. But Merz is there. He's supporting them. And that support is still very, very strong, very solid. But we've talked about the long-term trends. There have been really dramatic swings in opinion, a new view of Israel that just wasn't there. It was never, I saw anything like that. And, in my life, ever since I was conscious of politics, there was always this rock solid support for Israel. That has ended. we're seeing the end of that. Let's just put it that way. The rock from the people. Unfortunately, again, the elites, those in power, are still rock solid supporters. But maybe I'm a fool, but I think in the long run, that kind of support depends on, does have to have some sort of popular basis. The Israelis themselves clearly believe that because they have invested so much in trying to keep everybody believing in Israel. And they, to this day, I think the most recent Israeli budget set aside something like $750 million US for Hasbara, as for influence operations, mostly directed to the U.S.
It's gross. I don't like it.
Yeah.
But it's going to catch up with them, right? I mean, I feel like as we have more time to process things, as more things get unveiled, and then if the ICJ does finally have a ruling, then it surely will have to have some real damning repercussions for Israel, right? I mean, like and also, Jess, I would think I'm just wondering, like, what is the current flow of immigration and emigration of of Jews in and out of Israel now? I imagine there can't be that many coming back in, following their birthright program that they have, and
right?
To try to pull
amazingly, there is some, and there are some people that went rushing to Israel, like after October 7th, and to show their support to actually join the IDF. But my understanding is that the net flow was outward. It wasn't as huge as you might think. They certainly did lose, a significant fraction. I don't know exactly what the percentage was. So maybe just a couple percent of the population, but I think it's an important couple of percent. They tend to be the more cosmopolitan people, the better educated people on the average, and they have lost some of that. There's no question about it. I haven't seen recent figures, so I don't know if that trend is continuing or not. But
yeah, I just feel like the Zionists have just completely lost the narrative here. They every year they do this. Who's the Stop Anti-Semitism organization? They always do this Anti-Semite of the Year. I'm sure you've probably seen some around on X.
I think it's probably the ADL. I think is probably what you're talking about. Is that right?
No. This is something else, and they do something.
All right. There are many organizations.
Yeah, there are tons of them. But But every year, and now it's become kind of a thing amongst all these people that are talking, pro-Palestinian and against Zionism. It's a badge of honor for them to be labeled the anti-Semite of the year, and they're always like, "Please vote for me as anti-Semite of the year." Making fun of it. But they've gone after Miss Rachel very hard. I don't know. You know who Miss Rachel is, just because I have little kids, so you've heard of them. It's a show that my little boys enjoy watching. And she's just the sweetest, kindest lady that's just very bubbly and happy. I mean, she sings little songs for 2-year-olds. I mean, that's what she does. And she she's great. She really is. The kids love her. But they're going after her so hard, and all she's saying is just like, I want every child has a right to live. I care about every child. I care about all children. That's what she's saying, and they go after her, and just, I see it. So they go after her so hard online. And it's just like this. Don't you guys understand? This is a bad look. This is a woman saying, I don't want children to die. And you're calling her an anti-Semite, nominating for anti-Semite of the year. And she's just the most innocent person that you can think of to go after. And just like, there's just no self-awareness.
Yeah.
And it's blowing my mind. It's like, the more money that you said they have, the $750 million Hasbro budget, it's like the more they spend on it and the more they do this type of stuff, it's just the more damning it is for them. I just don't understand how they can't understand that we don't like to see these children being killed. I just saw a picture of a 3-year-old girl that was shot yesterday, and a boy. I don't even want to talk about it. It's so horrible. Some of the things that I've seen, and we've all seen these things, and they don't understand that this is what we don't like, and we're watching this, and we're forced to pay for it through our taxpayer dollars. Don't they understand how this? I just don't understand why they can't bridge that gap, that self-awareness. Why can't they figure it out?
Yeah. Well, actually, you're right. And there have been some amazing statements, like often the most damning things that you can show about Israel and support for Israel, is not anything that a pro-Palestinian person says, but you just let them talk. And I think we probably all have seen, there's recently a former official of the Obama administration, I guess that was associated with the press office. I can't remember her exact title. A woman, but she went on, and it was just about, we have this real problem, like these people get obsessed with dead children. We have to go, we have to present our case, but we have to do it through this, push through mountains of dead children. It's just like she was angry about the whole thing. It's like, look, do you understand what you're saying? Yeah, the dead children are a problem. This is not a perception problem. This is a reality problem. But they just didn't seem to get that. That was because for them, I guess they simply don't care, and they don't understand why other people do care.
How is that possible? How can you not care about little children?
Yeah, I know it's hard to understand, but you see it. That's the thing that's so horrifying about this, and we've all seen it. Like among the Israelis themselves, you have all these selfies. These people that are just doing the soldiers that have killed a family, and now they've taken the apartment, and then they're playing with the toys that they find there and making a big joke out of it. Those kids are probably dead, and you probably killed them. That's the kind of thing. Or then you even have Israelis who are back home. They're not within Gazan territory, but they make what they think are funny videos, where they pretend to be starving Palestinians, that kind of thing. There's just a complete absence of compassion, of any kind of empathy. It's just, and they don't seem to be aware of it at all. For them, it is funny. It is just a big joke. But the rest of us who still have some humanity look at that and say, my God, there's something wrong with you people.
Right. And that's coming back to bite them. I mean, just the support obviously has dropped through the roof, but I just feel like there has to be some type of repercussion. And it's just always frustrating talking about this situation because it just grinds on and there's no change. Like, I'm hoping that there will be some type of self-reflection. We talked about this as well. Okay, maybe one thing with the ceasefire that'll give some time for people to self-reflect. Like, wait, what did we do? Let the everything kind of subside, and then it's like, oh my God, realize the actions that you've committed here, these atrocities, and maybe have some change domestically. But it just seems like things just kind of continue. The Hasbara is now intensified. Now it's a more just, we got to lock it down, and we still see dead kids on our phones, right, on a regular basis. It's just like, I mean, we shouldn't be seeing this content. This is horrific content. And it's like, who's the number one producer of dead children content? It's Israel. That's it. Mm-hmm. That's where we see it. It's just constant. It's like, hey, whoa, this is a problem. Nobody likes to see dead kids. Let's stop this. And right. it just won't. It's just unbelievable. And then, like you said, and then I feel like the Zionists, like you said, they're just upset. Like, oh man, wow, it's so tiring defending the dead children, us killing dead children all the time. It's making it difficult. That's the way they look at it. It's like, oh man, I got to go out there and fight anti-Semitism, by saying that these children should have died. That that was the right thing to blow these kids up. It's like, It's exciting.
It is quite extraordinary, but they just there's an absolute refusal to really address what's happened and to face the reality. For them, it's just a matter of perception management. And if people become passionately anti-Israel, then they're clearly pathological anti-Semites. They just can't. They're that's not an exaggeration. I think of the view of a majority of Israeli Jews and of Zionist Jews abroad.
Well, reality always wins, right? So eventually,
I hope so. Have to... Yeah, no, I'm hopeful. In the short run, I'm not at all hopeful. In the long run, I am. Actually, I'm more hopeful now that the whole Zionist project is going to fail now than I was before October 7th. because it seemed like then, they really had everything under control. Nobody was paying much attention to them. They were carrying out their slow motion ethnic cleansing, but it was, and getting away with it. They were there was already, let's say, an ebbing away of support among the younger generation in places like the U.S., but it wasn't nearly as dramatic as it is now. So they had some worries, but in general, it looked like they had things very much under control. And now you say, okay, yeah, they've seized this territory. But again, as you pointed out, they are an international pariah, and a lot of people really, really hate what they're doing, passionately, and that's a problem. They understand it's a problem, but they don't know how to fix it. And what they're doing is making it worse. Just as you've pointed out.
Yeah, I mean, the solution is so obvious to all of us to just say, "Hey, stop killing all these kids, women, and children." That's the solution. But
they made efforts to, obviously to gain more control over the media. We've seen that happen in this country, and then within Israel, the foreign press was supposed to be allowed into Gaza, but that has been put off, I think, again and again. That's one thing that would increase the scrutiny, I would think, if you get more and more of these people into Gaza, but they have kept them out. But it's in this new age, you still can't, even if you do impose these restrictions and you gain control of major media corporations, you can't stop the flow of the images, of the photos, because of this new media landscape that now exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at least for now, they may try. Who knows?
Yeah, I kind of worry about it. Yeah. They're right.
Okay, well let's finish off with Ukraine. Can we start with just maybe you giving us an update on the battlefield situation?
Yeah, it's really more the same. There hasn't, it is. The Russians are now in several different key cities and towns, and those are Guliapole, down in the south, and that's not going to last very long. They're already, they have, it's not a cauldron yet. They haven't closed it, but they have it surrounded on three sides, and they're in the city. And of course, Pokrovsk has actually long been under Russian control, really, almost with the exception of like a few holdouts and basements. But now it's official. The Ministry of Defense is generally very conservative about declaring these things. And a few days ago, it declared that Pokrovsk was completely under Russian control. It was like under 95, 99% control, even a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago or something. But it's completely under Russian control. And the Russians are expanding from there. It's not just that they're holding on, but they're already expanding. And it looks like the series of counterattacks that the Ukrainians were attempting, in an effort to de-block, to actually reach those soldiers that are holed up in Myrnohrad, has been abandoned. They know they can't do it. Now, it's really very unfortunate. Their Myrnohrad is still part of Myrnohrad. We may be down to half of it. Now, Myrnohrad was a city of, I think, something like 40,000, so approximately. It's a good-sized town, a very close suburb of Pokrovsk. But we have these people, and it appears to be at least 1,000 of them holed up there. They're still fighting. They're being supplied by drones. And why are they still fighting? That's a question that we asked earlier. And, I gave some answers. But there was another answer that came, interestingly through the war correspondent from Germany, Julian Rebke, who is a very, passionate supporter of Ukraine. But he's always been a realist. He's an honest reporter. And so, you have to respect him for that. He does describe things as, as they are to the best of his ability. And he actually managed to establish some sort of communication link with some of these soldiers that are holed up in Myrnohrad. And what he found was, first of all, they say there are about 1,000 of them. It was better than a month ago that the Russians said there were like 5,500. So I'm sure many of those were killed. Some of them surrendered. Some of them managed to escape because a month ago, there was there was still a possibility of escape, very difficult. But now they're down to 1,000. And they said that they're waiting. They've been told, that the Ukrainians are going to come and get them, that they're going to break through and rescue them and to hang on. And they seem to really believe it, which is really sad because it's not happening. And they've already, maybe there was some effort. It was never going to happen. And they're not even trying, but they still haven't been told the reality. And so many of them are still believing that if we just hang on for a few more days, our brothers will come and and we will be rescued and we will achieve a great victory.
Are these Ukrainian soldiers that are trapped in Myrnohrad, are they even fighting, or are they just hiding and waiting for?
Yeah, well, I don't even know what they can do. Because I think so much of, they may in some cases actually be engaged in fighting. I'm sure, there are Russians in the city. They have taken control of part of the city. So, close to there is a line of conflict within the city, and there's a certain amount of fighting going there. But so much of, the lethal power that's being directed against these holdouts is coming from the air and from far away, especially in the form of these fab bombs that just, that are enormously destructive. And, what can you do against that? You just wait and pray and hope it doesn't hit your building. And if it does, it's over.
And there seems to be a general consensus forming around that this war is over. Ukraine has lost. Is that true? Is that the sentiment, or is that just something that I'm getting because I'm part of this community?
Right. Well, no. If you get, you will get a very different picture of it if you leave the dissident community, and if you just read the New York Times. But it is seeping in at the edges. There's always been a certain amount of reality right on the fringes, in publications like the New York Times. Occasionally you find an article, and if you read it carefully, you realize that it's describing something pretty grim. I think that has grown, but all in all, the European position is supported. It's just that, again, Russia is, the sanctions are really starting to bite. They're losing huge numbers of men. And if we can just support the Ukrainians a little longer, or another year or something, Russia will be forced to come to the negotiating table, and they will, won't be able to make these maximalist demands that they're making now. I think that's essentially a position that you get from mainstream publications in the West. That's still there. It's still there. So it is quite extraordinary. But within Ukraine, I think there's a growing awareness that things are going bad. They know better. They're lied to a lot, and I think actually to a great degree, more than I really realized. But after reading a lot about Ukraine these last few months, understand that I think a lot of Ukrainians really didn't know what was going on, like in the Eastern Front, and still don't, because they have they have this abiding faith in the West, and they have, what happens really is that the Ukrainians feed this information to Western news organizations, and then Western news organizations publish it as fact. And then the Ukrainians see that that's what the Western news organizations are publishing, and a lot of them believe it, or a great part of it anyway. But that they don't believe it entirely, because, why do they run when the press gangs show up? Why is it that when somebody's grabbed off the street, the citizens, will rush over and actually break the windows and try to get these people out? Because they know on some level that this is bad. And so I haven't seen recent polls within Ukraine, but I suspect that they probably are. We already saw a movement in that direction towards accepting the Russian demands. And I imagine that is continuing. That trend is continuing and will accelerate over time.
Yeah, we talked about this abiding faith in the West, but I imagine this national security strategy paper that was released, that has to etch away at it, because it's talking about retrenchment, and the language that they use when they talk about Europe just shows that, we can't dedicate any resources here.
Yeah.
So isn't that just a serious blow in itself? Is that part of what the NSS was was just we talked about Trump and maybe his only way to get out of this in some ways just to completely walk away. Don't try to force some type of settlement. And in the NSS, that pairs well with the walking away strategy, because that's basically what it's saying. It's saying like this is, we got to pull ourselves out of these wars in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and focus on our hemisphere.
Yeah, right. Well, there is again just a note of realism throughout that strategy paper. There's no question about it. And one of the things that's said again and again is that we cannot dominate the world. In other words, we no longer can be the global hegemon. Now, you look at a lot of the behavior, so we still see a lot of signs that we seem to think that we can dominate the world. But there is that awareness, and it does appear very strongly in the paper. And yeah, I'm sure the Ukrainians are reading that, and they're getting very nervous. They're being reassured by their Western European allies.
That's not very reassuring.
I know, they shouldn't be. That's what they're telling him. What I've heard, there's actually reports is saying that do not, accede to these demands. We've got your back. But what does that mean? It's like, okay, like I told you the other day, what Macron gave them $100 million, and that was like good for half a day of their financial needs. That's, I guess it looks like the Europeans have all their hopes pinned on these Russian assets, that they're eyeing those assets hungrily. I think they realize that that's their only chance of at least, maintaining financial support for Ukraine. We're not even talking about the military support, but that's their only chance. And so like Belgium and the central bank, and I understand even the IMF have said, hey, don't do this. This is a very bad idea. There are a lot of European leaders that are pushing very, very hard for this, trying to make it happen. And that because I think they see they're facing this fiscal cliff, and they're making these promises to Ukraine. And the only way that they can carry through on any part of those promises is really if they steal these assets. So they are highly motivated to do that.
Yeah, but it seems like you said, the IMF, the ECB, Belgium itself, Euroclear, they know, and they just say no. So, and the law's on their side. They say, hey, no, we can't steal. And then Ursula von der Leyen must steal this money.
Yeah, right. They understand it's a legal question, the liability, the reputation of European finance. That's all very true. That right there, that's the main, argument that's being made by these people who are saying don't steal it. But then some of them have also pointed out it's like the Russians can hit back. There are assets that they can seize, and it's going to hurt. So, again, don't do this. All those things are there. It's really and it seems to me, again, it's like if you can't convince your own people to support this war, then, and you're a democracy, then you say, okay, well, we tried, but our people are against it. We're democracies. They like the idea of supporting Ukraine, but they do not want to pay for it. And we have to accept that, right? If they were real democracies, that's what they would do. But, we see what they're doing.
Right. Well, it seems like in the West, there's just this complete inability to think long term. It's just everything is just about solving the immediate problem now. And I think it's just the basis of how our political systems work, where you just care about, you just care about your term, and you're only gonna be here for 4 years. So you don't care what happens after. So it's just fundamentally flawed. I mean, they don't think like, well, what are the repercussions of if we steal this money? That eventually this war will end. And Russia will be able to take you to an international court somewhere. And this will haunt you for 50 years of litigating how you stole all this money. And, it's just going to be a nightmare. But they don't care, because it's like, I won't be in power. It's not my problem. I don't care about my country.
I think Russia might be able to do it even before the end of the war. I don't know the actual law involved. But I would agree that there is this real serious problem of short-termism and an inability to really think strategically and realistically. And there's probably a lot that has gone into that. I think part of it is a consequence of being number one and being prosperous and being at peace for so many decades that they really lost the ability to think through these things. Just like the assumption everything's going to be okay. We just got to figure out how to win the next election. Again, if you're a country like Russia that's just climbing out of the abyss from the 1990s, you have to say, we have to make the right decisions or we're in deep trouble. We fall back into the abyss. We have to climb out of this. We have to, allocate our resources wisely and pursue policies that strengthen us. Reality is something that they cannot ignore. And so they learn to think realistically and strategically. And it's true of China too, which has climbed out of very abject poverty back in the 1980s. But I think sometimes it's being prosperous for so long, it just becomes like you don't really suffer any consequences for your actions. You do stupid things, but you have enough of a cushion that it doesn't make any difference. It's kind of like a child who grew up in a very wealthy family and does all kinds of crazy things that would like ruin a child in a normal family or a poor family. You say, oh, you end up in jail for that, and then you're branded for life and whatever, and you're never going to get a good job. But because their parents could always bail them out or something. It's sort of, it's not a perfect analogy, but I think it does work to some extent. And it's just like now we have these people that just don't seem to be able to think strategically and realistically. And now they find themselves in a fix, and it's just like they've lost that whole ability is gone.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just feel like these democratic systems aren't just really conducive to long-term strategic thinking because you just care about this election cycle, right? I mean, it doesn't. I mean, I understand the dangers of having a more authoritarian where there's no term limits and you might have somebody that's in power for 20, 30 years. But hey, that means it's just like you have a CEO of a company. You don't want to change the CEO every couple of years, and it's like the company's going to go nowhere. There's no direction. You need to have some type of vision to be and time to lay it out. And the Chinese are great because they always have these 5-year plans, and they're always releasing it. They just had one 6 months ago. I forget, was that 13th 5-year plan or something? I forget, but it clearly lays out what they're planning to do, and then they have 50-year plans, 25-year plans. They think long term. Like they run their country more like a business is how I would say, actually, in many ways. It's a very meritocracy. You do hit certain benchmarks on a provincial level and you move up, or on a city level to the provincial or whatever. And we just don't have that system. It's just all about getting up there and say America's number one and make people feel good and how we're going to spend more money for whatever it is that you wanted money to be spent on.
Yeah. And the problem is like, okay, when eventually these problems, you let these problems accumulate and grow, and they get to the point where, okay, you have to address them, but the solution will have, in the short run, will have very negative effects. And so, just like we're looking at this, the U.S. is looking at this huge fiscal crisis. Our debt has become so huge, everybody really knows that it's unsustainable. We need to do anything, but cuts to services, increased taxes, those are not popular moves, right? So it's just like better to look the other way and let's just hope the collapse occurs on the next guy's watch. And that's what happens. Yeah. Right. Yeah, no, there is a problem with short-termism, and I guess it's always a problem within democracies. Though if you just have a strong political culture, I think to some extent it can be overcome, and it has been in the past. We just lack that strong political culture, people that are committed to the long-term prosperity of the people or of the nation. That's gone.
Right. Actually, it's something you told me in the beginning of our talks, is saying that it's not so much the system of government that matters. It's more that you have people that are in your government that actually have the best interests of the people at heart. That's really the most important thing. And
yeah, you can have a terrible, actually authoritarian regime that's actually fixated on short-term results. It certainly happened, Yeah. Right. I think that's really very true. It's really the people, again, the ruling elite. What are they? What do they think? What are they? What are their real commitments? And that's what really determines, whether it's a democracy or not. In the end, is that elite that really makes the decisions.
Right.
That elite does have to take, democracy kind of ensures that they have to take at least some of the interests of people into account. And but as we can see, they can also ignore those interests, and they do often.
Right, right. There's a fixation in America and the West in general to look at systems of government instead of just like, well, what's best? Are the people they're doing better or not?
Yeah,
Just
right.
the real, what the substance, what really matters. Just one last thing before I wrap it up. I don't know if you heard anything about this, but I saw something on Twitter about Russia and the ICJ. That, there was I guess Ukraine tried to bring something to the ICJ against Russia, but now there's been a reverse Uno played. And now the ICJ is looking at Russia's argument that actually Ukraine was trying to commit a genocide in the Donbass of eastern Ukraine, and they're taking it seriously. Is that true?
Right.
So you can explain it?
Well, what I understand, I haven't looked at it very closely, but yeah, I read about it. The Russians brought this case against the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians tried to strike it down on various procedural grounds, and what's happened recently is they failed. The ICJ says, no, the Ukrainian protests, their objections do not stand, and we're going ahead with this case. And apparently the Russians have prepared it very well. They have, like 10,000 documents, and yeah, I think they probably have a real case because, similar is to what you have in Israel, you have people in power talking about just killing Russians or, even just eliminating them all together from the East. There are statements like that. And there are, there are a lot of military actions that are just clearly where many, and they continue to this day that clearly are being directed directly against civilians.
Yeah,
so
I
I think
remember
they
seeing. I remember seeing a video of Poroshenko even just saying like, I want Russian-speaking children in eastern Ukraine, like hiding in basements, not to go out. Like, we want them to live in fear and terror. Like, it's like, whoa, man. Like, it's such a bad decision. I just don't know why people can't figure this out. Don't go after kids. It's never good. It's never a good look. When you start talking about we want to kill kids or we want them to live in fear, it's like now. How's that going to work out for you, man? I mean, just think about it. How evil can you be if you start talking about that? It's just like, it is wild. So it's so crazy to think that maybe when this all plays out, we'll look back upon this period and be like, okay, the two governments that the United States was supporting and backing, Israel and Ukraine, they both are found guilty of genocide or attempted genocide or something like this.
Yeah, it's not impossible. It could very well happen.
I think it probably will if it's a real institution, right? Do you think?
Yeah, the ICJ seems to be. I think these are serious jurists. I think there's no question about it. They've shown that in dealing with Israel. And I think we'll see the same. I think there's a good chance anyway. So we'll see the same. Maybe it doesn't rise to the point of genocide. But I don't know exactly. But there's clearly, there clearly is on the part of many Ukrainians. I don't think this, of Ukrainians in power within the military and the government, there is a genocidal intent on the part of some of them, a significant fraction of them.
Okay, well, the times they are changing. It seems like I get frustrated when we talk about the West and to say, why can't they have any realism? And I just have to think about it as a huge tanker, this unipolar moment that we lived in, the bureaucracy that's been built around it, all the momentum behind it. And it keeps on bumping into icebergs of reality, but it is slowly shifting. At least that's what this NSS document that was dropped.
I think it's true. I gave sort of like there's two extreme interpretation or let's say alternative realities that I was looking at. One is like J.D. Vance, who I think certainly wrote part of this, takes over, really consolidates it, makes it real, the whole thing. The other is that the Democrats come roaring back and they just throw the whole thing and they just go back to the Biden, way of doing things. And I have to say both are possible. But most likely the way things work out, it'll be somewhere in the middle. Because the thing about this, no matter what your ideas are, there is a reality, and I think that this strategy paper does actually begin to reflect the changing realities, and it shows this growing acceptance of it. And no matter what, if you come from the left or the right, from the Democrats or the Republicans, that's not going to change. And I think that at least parts of this new policy are going to just inevitably be accepted because, again, it's the reality.
Right. Okay, well, I think we can end it there, Dad.
Okay.
All right, have a good rest of your day.
Okay. You
okay.
too.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.